Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're having a wonderful day. As the subtitle says, I'm making a few quick additions to the Alex Grand videos. I think Grand did a wonderful job of giving you all the information you should need for an overview, and that's all this class is an overview. But I think he made the assumption that all of the viewers were going to be people like me who were old and who understood what the shadow was and understood some of those other things. And I think I just want to fill in a few gaps. Maybe he hit all of these things and it just didn't resonate with me when I watched it. But like I said, I'm going to fill in what I believe are a few gaps and perhaps just tie things to last week a little bit and set us up for weeks 3 and 4. First, as always, all borrowed images and quoted text are used for educational purposes. I am not trying to make any money. The first recognized comic strip, the one that most people will talk about as the first, at least in the United States. And we're not talking about going back to when Martin Luther started the Reformation and Catholics and Luther's followers were exchanging barbs in comic form. We're not talking about Ben Franklin, who used word balloons. We're just talking about the first recognized comic strip was the Yellow Kid. And I think the Yellow Kid's important for number one, he produced panels. Number two, there was text on the shirt, and that text eventually became speech balloons. And number three, the marketing. Right now, we have Captain America or Spider Man selling cereal or Pop Tarts or whatever. The Yellow Kid was on cigar boxes, cigarettes, whiskey, a lot of other products, apparently, soaps and fancy fans for women. All of those things, the Yellow Kid was so popular, he was used to market. And I think that that makes him an important part of the comics history and a precursor to the American comic book. Second, I want to talk about the Cuts and Jammer Kids. The Cuts and Jammer Kids every week did the same thing. The kids pulled a prank, the kids got punished, we repeat, and eventually it got to the point where people began to see this as subversive. The moral of the story should have been the kids got caught, the kids got punished, the kids were repentant. That didn't happen. And because of that, the public began to see them as subversive. The public began to see them as somehow not encouraging people to go in the proper moral direction. There were other comics that did that, a Buster Brown comic. There were books, the Horatio Alger stories were all about a good little boy or a good little girl doing good little things and being rewarded, or a bad little boy or a bad little girl doing terrible things and being punished. The part about the backlash from the public, I think, is important in the fact that comic books also created a backlash. And when you watch the Grand videos, the idea of the Senate committee, the idea of uh, Kefauver almost trying to destroy the industry, those sorts of things I think were important because comics always create a backlash. And recently, we've had a backlash when Superman renounced his American citizenship and became a citizen of the world. We had a backlash on the panel that showed Captain America saying, Hail Hydra. We've had backlash over gay characters or any number of things. Also, it's important to understand that America's political obsessions are nothing new. The Katzenjammer kids were too German for the American public during World War One, and because of that, they became the Shenanigan kids because Shenanigan wasn't German in the way Katzenjammer is. In the comic strips, Dick Tracy, I think, is important. And I'm not sure that Grand quite gives you the idea of the tough cop, the idea of the importance of that image, or the idea of the rogues gallery. And I think he does some of that. But again, I just want to reemphasize this idea of the rogues gallery. Right now, The Flash is famous for his rogues gallery in his comic. Batman is famous for his rogues gallery in the comic. And I think Tracy makes that possible. Even if his characters were things like Itchy or Prune Face, and even if the only character he really has that's anything that's close to being dangerous is Flat Top, the idea that he was always chasing the same characters and that these characters would get out of jail and commit crimes and he would have to catch them again became part and parcel of the comic book world. Moving on to the comic strips, Miss Fury. Grant has his own separate video on Miss Fury. I didn't want to go into that deep of a dive. It's important, I think, that Miss Fury is created by Tarpe Mills, a woman. And so Miss Fury is a female character created by a female author. The black leopard skin becomes the costume. She's the rich socialite, the same sort of thing that you would have with a Batman or a Green Arrow or a Tony Stark. And she became this crime busting nemesis of gangsters and evil. And in World War II, along with every other hero, busted Nazis and saboteurs. And I think it's important to understand that the vast majority of the characters start at the start were male, and she's an important exception. And if you look at the costume, certainly you can see the Black Cat, you can see Catwoman, you can see other female characters molded upon how her costume was created and used. Grand talks a lot about Doc Savage. I wanted to make sure that you had a few seconds to just take a look at Doc Savage from the comic book, to take a look at the, rather normal way he was shown on the covers of pulp magazines with the shirt torn off, the bronze skin, the heavy muscles, the idea that he was the perfect specimen of a human being. He had a cousin named Patricia Savage who joined him on a lot of his adventures. And once again, I think it's important to understand that the vast majority of the heroes today have some sort of supporting cast. And Doc had a huge supporting cast. Monk, who was a famous chemist, Ham, who was an attorney, well dressed, okay, Rennie, who was able to slam through solid doors, who was an engineer, Long Tom, who was an expert in electricity, Johnny, who was a geologist, Little John, and there was bickering between them. If you look at the screen, you can see that Monk was calling the lawyer a shyster. The lawyer was calling him the missing link. They were talking back and forth. But the fact of the matter is, this supporting cast was as important as the character himself. Just like Alfred is probably as important as Batman or Robin or any of the other characters, these sort of supporting casts were central to the Doc Savage character, at least. And it's important to understand that once again, this was something that was merged into the comic books. Grand once again mentions the shadow. But unless I wasn't paying close attention when I listened to the videos a couple times before I put them in, the taglines, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?" Or at the conclusion of each show, "The weed of crime bears bitter fruit, and the shadow wants to make sure that crime does not pay." And the shadow's famous for the laugh, this maniacal laugh when he is someplace where the criminals don't expect expect him, excuse me, when he is not able to be seen because he has used whatever it was to cloud their minds. Sometimes it's a mystical force almost. Other times it's just a trick, a little bit of magic trick that somebody would use on stage. Whatever it was, every week on the radio, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The shadow knows. And then there's the laugh. I think it's important to understand that all the links to Batman, or all the links to Daredevil, or all the links to any of the other characters that you want to make from the shadow, he stood alone with all of this extra verbiage and all of these extra things that were part and parcel of who the character was. The Lone Ranger began in books and pulps, but came to the radio. The Green Hornet, to the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, but I believe to the best of my knowledge, the Green Hornet began on the radio. And yet, the idea of connection was made clear from the Western to the pulp. And I think early comics made use of the cowboy figure. There was the Rawhide Kid, there was Kid Colt, Jonah Hex on DC side of it. At the same time, I think if you look here, the connection between the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet as part of the marketing. John Reed rides a stallion named Silver, assisted by a Native American named Tonto. The Green Hornet is Britt Reed. He is John Reed's great nephew. He drives a car called Black Beauty. He is assisted by Kato, who on a TV series was portrayed by Bruce Lee, one of the great martial arts actors of all time. And the idea of linkage, the idea of carrying through from a previous generation, from a previous art form into a new art form or across art forms was an important element. Comics borrowed from the pulp, radios borrowed from the pulp borrowed from radio, both borrowed from literature. And I think it's just an important element that there have always been these kind of linkages between various art forms in superhero comic book sorts of fantasy. Zorro began once again in print. The idea of somebody in the early, you know, 19th century, in the early 1800s, fighting with the sword because guns were basically a flintlock and the sword was much better. The gentlemanly actions, the idea that he was seen as almost effeminate when he was De La Vega, those sorts of things I think are an important element of the character. You can look again, you can see the Batman, the mask, the long cape, the dressed in black, the dark colors, the skill level with the sword, Batman's skill with all the technology. Those sorts of things were, I think, direct borrowings all across. The rich guy hiding in the cave, again, the great horse, the Batmobile, all of those things, the direct lineage is there. But I want to make sure that the image is clear. And again, the idea that this was borrowed from print first and then moved into film, and comics still use Zorro to this day. Finally, I want to talk about Tarzan and Edgar Rice Burroughs, and the fact that Edgar Rice Burroughs created other pulp characters like John Carter, science fiction or fantasy stories about beings that lived on Mars or Venus or in the Earth's core. And once again, Gail Simone does a crossover a few years back with Tarzan and Red Sonja. The idea that modern characters are linked to these pulp characters, in part because the me Tarzan, you Jane element of the rich Lord Greystoke who lives in the jungle, having inherited all of this stuff and having been raised by apes, maybe doesn't fly as much anymore. But merging that character's physical appearance and skill set with other pulp characters, other fantasy characters, still works. And if I haven't made the point enough, because of the public domain, because of licensing, all of these characters have come into the comics. There was a short series where Dynamite owned the rights to the Shadow, DC owned Batman, licensing agreements happened, and the Batman and Shadow had a crossover. There was a series called Masks where Zorro somehow showed up in the 20th century. The Shadow was there, the Green Hornet was there, Miss Fury was there. All of these great mask characters from the pulp became part of the crossover. And the tagline was, before there were superheroes, there were masks. They didn't put these characters in the superhero club, category, whatever you want to call it. They talked about the masks and they acted as they would in the pulps. And finally, I don't want to talk about movies very much, but I do want to talk about one television show, the 1966 Batman, and one ultimate campy crossover where Batman and Robin met the Green Hornet and Kato in a two-part episode that is truly horrific and wonderful at the same time. And if you get a chance, I think you can find it on YouTube if you're interested. I'm going to wrap it up here. I think it's important to understand the lineage. I'm not going to go into all of the history of Superman, all of the history of Batman. We'll talk about the history of Wonder Woman a little next week and tie it to the mythology. But I'm not going to ask you to memorize or know a list of dozens and dozens of heroes and who came first. What I want us to understand in this overview is that comics did not spring from somebody's mind like Athena sprang from the head of Zeus. Comics have a history in the newspapers, and comics have a history in the pulps, and comics have a history from radio. And Alex Grand does a great job in those docuseries that I'm asking you to watch. I just wanted to fill in a couple of gaps so that you can kind of have a little bit of background as you look at Grand's videos. Again, hope everybody has a good week, and we'll talk to you next week when we talk about mythology.